Hello and welcome back to the Go Karts and Good Times YouTube channel. Today, I'm finally going to be pulling the blown up engine out of my 2007 Impreza 2.5i. If you've seen any of my other Impreza videos besides the first one, you'll know that this engine had a terrible oil burning issue and was not taken well care of by its past owner. What this meant for me was excessive oil consumption and the engine running itself low on oil. Something that the previous owner probably didn't notice because he did not seem that mechanically inclined. I'm not trying to talk bad about the guy, I'm just trying to establish a background for why I am where I am needing this new motor. Like I mentioned in the last video, the car's been sitting while I waited for the time to get the engine removed and start working on the new one. Without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. First, by getting all the fluids drained so that they don't make a mess when I try and get the engine out. With the car jacked up, now I can climb underneath and get the oil drained out, which should be especially interesting because the blown up motor's oil should have tons of little bits of metal in it or debris. Who knows, I may even find coolant and milky colored oil. I also just realized after wearing it all day that funnily enough, I'm wearing the Subaru hat that was gifted to me by a friend for Christmas. With the car jacked up, you can also see the stainless exhaust that I've retrofitted for my car in a previous video. Trying not to make a mess, it's time to get this oil drain plug removed so that we can see what the oil looks like. I'm not sure how much you can see on camera, but in person, it's kind of crazy how shimmery or even silver the oil looks on the bottom of the drain plug or in the pan. As the last bits of oil drip out, and I shine the camera with the light on towards the pan, you can see all the shimmery little bits throughout the oil. I want to state early in the video with the engine bay popped open here that I'm not going to go through extra lengths to make the engine bay look pretty or clean it up drastically. If there are little things I can do along the way, I will, but this car really just needs to work again. That being said, with the comments about the rust, this engine bay really doesn't look that bad for a Northeast car where the roads are heavily salted. The strut towers look good, and the frame rails also look good. With the oil drain plug installed finger tight, and the oil drained, I can now move on to the coolant system. With the drain pan on standby, I can start looking for the best place to drain the system. And I just want to note that the coolant system is so much easier to be messier and get all over the place depending on how you go about doing it and removing the system from the car. Most ways you go at it, you're going to make a mess, so I'm opting to remove this small water line in an attempt to control the flow of the water as I drain it. It's attached to the water pump housing and is pretty low on the engine, so hopefully I can get most of it out. With the clamp removed, I can now try to get the line off of the nipple. Just like that, it's beginning to drain. And while it is spurting, it is pretty controlled and staying within the confines of my drain bucket. In my case, leaving it on a majority of the time helped me control the flow of water out, but getting towards the end of the draining process, you do want to remove your radiator cap so that you relieve the pressure in the system created by draining the fluid and allow it all to get out. Like you can see with this engine, we have cardboard sitting under it because no matter how long you let it drain, there's always going to be a little bit of coolant stuck somewhere inside the block, and you want to be prepared for when you turn the engine around and it spills. While I'm still waiting for the coolant to drain, I can start removing different parts that are holding the engine in or otherwise attached to it. Starting with simple stuff like the intake and the exhaust, and then moving to electrical components. While accessories are a little bit down the line, you may notice that the new engine does not come with any. This means that I'll be reusing all of the ones from the old engine, and I have to note that things like the power steering and the AC are things that I can leave in the car and peel away to the side so that I don't have to drain lines that would otherwise be a pain in the butt to refill. I do also want to say that before removing anything, I will be taking many pictures so that I know where everything goes, and be using tape and baggies to label hardware and hoses. After removing a small pile of parts, I'm starting to realize that there isn't much holding this engine back in. I still have to get these main radiator hoses, I still have to get the accessories taken off, and I still probably have a couple of small vacuum and electrical plugs. But other than that, after I get these things done, then I can start undoing the motor mounts and the bell housing bolts to get this thing finally pulled out. One of the main conveniences about how the electrical was designed by Subaru is that it's very self-contained, which is afforded by this large plug on the back of the engine. I do want to note that if you'll actually be doing this yourself, finesse is key. It's always better to be patient rather than start breaking small pieces of hardware or clips that are old and crusty. I also want to say that having as much surface area to lay out parts you remove, the better. Next, I'll move on to the accessories, which have to be removed before I go about taking off any major mounts. After fighting with hidden bolts for way too long, the accessories are finally removed. That being said, I think I actually made good progress tonight so that I can come back tomorrow and actually get the motor pulled and start assessing everything and ordering parts. Just like that, I'm back for another day and it's time to get working. Obviously, I forgot to mention this yesterday, but something that'll really help with clearance when trying to pull the engine is removing the radiator, which will give us a lot of room up front and make the process easier in the long run. I doubt you can see any of it. I finally got done struggling with these heater lines, go to the back of the engine for coolant. Instead of trying to use the quick disconnect, what we did is take the fuel line off farther down the line at the pressure regulator, which doesn't really matter anyway because we're still going to be using this intake on the new engine, so it can just drop back into place and we can reattach these lines later. The radiator is also removed and you can see there's tons of room for activities up front here. So now I'm going to move on to getting the nuts on the bottom of the motor mounts undone. I'm not sure how much you can see, but there is the engine mount and there is the nut I have to undo to get it released. It's now finally time to remove the bell housing bolts, and as long as the engine and the mounts that are bolted to it are still sitting on the subframe, it's not really going to go anywhere, so we can remove all but one or even all of the bolts on the bell housing before we actually have to put the puller on. Correction, this car actually does have bolts and nuts, so if you're doing this yourself, you want to look out for that. And a note, if you put the engine puller on too early, it will get in your way, so it's better to get as many off as possible before you hook it up. Unbolting a bunch of hidden nuts and bolts is not something interesting or that you'll see, and if you go to do it yourself, you can look up a diagram of where they are anyway, so I'm just going to get to it. With all the bell housing bolts removed, and the engine puller attached, we can now start the process of jiggling it loose. After battling with some stuck dowel pins, the engine is finally removed from the car. I also did go ahead and remove the flywheel and the clutch. As you can see, this clutch isn't that bad. It's not eating into the rivets yet, but the pucks of clutch material are gone and it's close, so now is a great time to replace it anyway. The flywheel doesn't look too bad, all things considered, but it could definitely use a replacement or at least be turned down to a clean surface. I can feel a bit of scoring with my nail, and across the surface, it's not completely even, so I may consider getting a new one or getting it turned like I just mentioned. Now it's just a process of getting this stuff cleaned up just enough so that I can start getting these engines laid out and disassembled. However, that is where the contents of this video will end. This video was supposed to be just about the engine pull, and we did exactly that, getting me ready for the next steps of the engine swap. This wasn't exactly a how-to video, just documenting my process with the engine swap, but hopefully if you needed it, you gained something from watching. Again, I just want to reiterate that I'm not an expert. I'm just figuring things out as I go. It's kind of like a big puzzle to me, and I'm documenting my process of figuring out that puzzle. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, I'd appreciate it if you liked, commented, or even subscribed to the channel. And for now, this is me signing off.